The quiet of dawn was a lonely sound. Clara Hale stood alone in the stillness of her cabin, her fingers trembling as she slipped the wedding ring from her hand. It had been there for so long it felt like a part of her very bone, warmed by years of memory, worn smooth by work and by waiting. But now, as the pale morning light crept through the cracks in the walls, the simple gold band felt heavier than iron. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the dead grass. It sounded like a warning, a sad song she didn't want to hear. Clara closed her eyes and pressed the ring to her lips, a final, silent farewell. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words were for the man who had placed it on her finger, and for the promise she was about to break. A mile down the dirt road lay the frontier town of Red Willow. Its false front buildings were still asleep, the saloon lamps burning low from the night before. Others just shrugged, saying the law didn't care much for truth either way. Clara had been forced to bury him in her heart, because there was no grave to mark his passing. She had accepted her life as a widow, a ghost haunting the edges of her own memories. But last night, everything changed. A rider had come through the storm, his horse slick with sweat, his eyes sharp with an urgent message. He was half frozen and didn't give his name. He just delivered the words that shattered her world, saying the law didn't care much for truth either way. Clara had been forced to bury him in her heart, because there was no grave to mark his passing. She had accepted her life as a widow, a ghost haunting the edges of her own memories. But last night, everything changed. A rider had come through the storm, his horse slick with sweat, his eyes sharp with an urgent message. He was half frozen and didn't give his name. He just delivered the words that shattered her world. "Elias Hale is alive. He's scheduled to hang in 3 days." And so now, Clara walked. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon as she pushed open the door to Red Willow's pawnshop. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, old oil, and quiet regret. The man behind the counter barely looked up from his ledger as she laid the wedding ring down on the worn wood between them. It caught the morning light, the small diamond in its center, dull but stubborn, just like the love it had once sealed. "It belonged to my husband," she said, her voice soft but steady. The pawnbroker finally looked up. He picked up the ring, squinted at it through a small lens, and weighed it in his palm. His expression was unmoved. "Won't fetch much," he grunted. "It's all I have." He studied her face then, really looked at her. He saw the worn fabric of her dress, patched and faded, in her posture. But he also saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes that had cried too many tears already but refused to be broken. After a long moment, he slid a small stack of bills across the counter. "That's the best I can do." Her hand hovered over the money, hesitating. For a split second, she almost pulled back, almost snatched the ring and ran back to the lonely safety of her cabin. But then, an image of Elias flashed in her mind. Her hand hovered over the money, hesitating. For a split second, she almost pulled back, almost snatched the ring and ran back to the lonely safety of her cabin. But then, an image of Elias flashed in her mind. Clara clutched the precious bills inside her coat and prayed they would be enough not just to save Elias's life, but somehow, to buy back the truth. Stonebridge Prison rose from the flat earth like a scar. It was a fortress of gray stone, iron bars, and tall watchtowers silhouetted against a lowering, bruised sky. The place radiated hopelessness. The sheriff at the main gate was a hard man with tired, cynical eyes. He looked her up and down, unimpressed. "I'm here about Elias Hale," Clara said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but she held his gaze. The sheriff frowned, a deep line forming between his brows. "That name's been dead a long time, ma'am." "Then why is he still breathing?" she countered. Something shifted behind the man's tired eyes. A flicker of surprise, maybe even curiosity. He hesitated for a long moment, then, with a heavy sigh, he motioned her inside. The cell block smelled of rust. "I'm here about Elias Hale," Clara said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but she held his gaze. The sheriff frowned, a deep line forming between his brows. "That name's been dead a long time, ma'am." "Then why is he still breathing?" she countered. Something shifted behind the man's tired eyes. A flicker of surprise, maybe even curiosity. He hesitated for a long moment, then, with a heavy sigh, he motioned her inside. The cell block smelled of rust, damp stone, and despair. His shoulders were thinner, stooped under a weight she couldn't imagine. His hands, the same hands that had built their home and held her close, were shackled in heavy iron. But when he slowly lifted his head, his eyes were the same. Those kind, steady eyes that had first captured her heart. Their gazes met across 3 years of lies and a wall of iron bars. "Clara," his voice was a cracked, disbelieving whisper, like the sound of dry wood splitting. His hands, the same hands that had built their home and held her close, were shackled in heavy iron. But when he slowly lifted his head, his eyes were the same. Those kind, steady eyes that had first captured her heart. Their gazes met across 3 years of lies and a wall of iron bars. "Clara," his voice was a cracked, disbelieving whisper, like the sound of dry wood splitting. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and determination. "I sold my ring." Elias's gaze dropped to her hand, to the pale, bare skin where her ring had been for so many years. A look of pain crossed his face, sharper and deeper than any fear of the gallows. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Clara, why would you do that?" She looked right into his eyes, her own resolve hardening like steel. "Because I won't let them take you from me again," she said. "Not without a fight." Elias's gaze dropped to her hand, to the pale, bare skin where her ring had been for so many years. A look of pain crossed his face, sharper and deeper than any fear of the gallows. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Clara, why would you do that?" She looked right into his eyes, her own resolve hardening like steel. "Because I won't let them take you from me again," she said. "Not without a fight." A look of pain crossed his face, sharper and deeper than any fear of the gallows. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Clara, why would you do that?" She looked right into his eyes, her own resolve hardening like steel. "Because I won't let them take you from me again," she said. "Not without a fight." His voice breaking. "Clara, why would you do that?" She looked right into his eyes, her own resolve hardening like steel. Right into his eyes, her own resolve hardening like steel. "Because I won't let them take you from me again," she said. "Not without a fight." Clara turned slowly to face this man. He tipped his hat in a mock gesture of politeness, revealing the face of the very cattle baron whose murder had condemned her husband, the man who was supposed to be dead, and he was smiling. "Thank you for watching." If this story has you on the edge of your seat, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. We'll see you in the next part. The cattle baron's smile did not reach his eyes. He stood just beyond the iron bars of the cell, his clean coat unwrinkled, his boots polished as if he had stepped straight out of a Sunday sermon instead of this grimy prison corridor. His name came back to me in a rush. Silas Crow, the most powerful man between Red Willow and the mountain pass. The man my husband, Elias, had supposedly murdered 3 years ago. Well, Crow repeated softly, tilting his head with a cruel kind of amusement. Looks like the dead man has company. Elias rose slowly from the rough bunk, the chains on his wrists clinking like a rattlesnake's warning. His voice was low but steady, a rock in the middle of a flood. You shouldn't be here, he said. Crow let out a low chuckle. Funny. I was thinking the same thing about you. It's hard to haunt a man when you're still breathing. Before my own fear could root me to the spot, I stepped forward. My voice trembled, but I forced the words out. If you're alive, I said. My gaze locked on him. Then my husband is innocent. The corridor fell silent. It was as if even the other prisoners, hardened and lost, held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Crow's eyes slid from my face down to my hand. He noticed the bare finger, the space where my wedding ring used to be. A flicker of something that looked like satisfaction crossed his face. Innocent is a comfortable word, Crow replied, his voice smooth as oil. The truth is rarely that tidy. The warden, a portly man who seemed to shrink in Crow's presence, cleared his throat. Mr. Crow has business with the county judge, he explained, avoiding our eyes. He just came to observe. The proceedings, Elias echoed, his voice laced with bitter irony. You mean my hanging? Crow stepped closer to the bars, his expensive cologne filling the stale air. You see, Hale, this town needs closure. It needs a villain. You were just convenient. You framed me, Elias stated, the accusation hanging heavy between them. Crow leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, meant only for us. I survived you. That's all history will remember. In that moment, the full weight of it all crashed down on me. The lie, stretched across years, held together by fear and power. I finally understood why that mysterious rider had come for me in the storm, why someone wanted me here. They didn't just want Elias dead, they wanted me to watch. Crow straightened up and tipped his hat, a perfect gentleman performing a monstrous act. 3 days, he said calmly. Enjoy the reunion. As he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall, my legs nearly gave out. I had to grip the cold iron bars to keep from falling. That night, I stayed in the prison's visitors' quarters. The wind howled outside like a grieving animal, and I stared at the ceiling, sleep a distant memory. Every tick of the clock felt like a second being stolen from Elias's life. By morning, I had a plan. Or at least, something that felt close enough to hope that I could pretend it was one. The judge of Stonebridge was an old man with shaking hands and tired morals that had likely been bought and sold a dozen times over. I waited outside his office, refusing to leave, until he finally sighed and waved me in. They say you're a widow, he said, his tone gentle, almost pitying. They're wrong, I replied, my voice firm. And so are you. I laid the money on his desk, every single bill I had left from selling my ring. His eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting Silas Crow to burst in at any moment. This won't buy justice, the judge said, his voice barely a whisper. "No," I answered, "but it might buy a little courage." And then I told him everything. The rider in the storm, Crow's chilling visit to the jail, the key witness who had vanished without a trace 3 years ago, and the undeniable fact that the man Elias was condemned for murdering was very much alive. The judge listened, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long, heavy moment. "You're asking me to reopen a closed case," he said finally, "against the most powerful man in this entire territory." I met his weary gaze. "I am asking you to look a living man in the eyes before you sign his death warrant." That afternoon, I returned to the prison. Elias stood when he saw me, his face etched with worry. "You shouldn't be wasting your time on me," he said quietly. "You need to go. Leave this place. Start over somewhere new." I shook my head, my resolve hardening. "I didn't sell my wedding ring just to walk away from you." He studied my face then, memorizing every line, like a man who was already halfway gone. "Clara Crow won't let me live," he said, his voice raw with a terrible certainty. "Even if the truth does come out, he'll find a way. Then we have to make the truth louder than him." That evening, as the guards changed shifts, a young jailer named Thomas slipped a folded note through the bars. His hand was trembling. When no one was looking, I snatched it. My heart pounded as I unfolded it. The scribbled words made my blood run cold. Asterisk, I was there the night Crow was shot. I saw who pulled the trigger. Meet me by the old quarry at sunrise. At dawn, the world was coated in a layer of frost that looked like ash. The quarry was a silent, gaping wound carved into the earth. Thomas stood at the edge, his face pale and his body shaking in the frigid air. "I couldn't speak before," he stammered, his words coming out in puffs of white mist. "Crow, he threatened my family, but I can't watch an innocent man die. I just can't." Before I could even answer, a single sharp crack echoed through the silence. A rifle shot. Thomas jerked backward, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. And then, he fell, tumbling over the edge and into the dark pit below. I screamed, a sound that was swallowed by the vast, empty landscape. High on the ridge above, I saw the silhouette of a horse and rider thundering away into the gray morning. Standing there alone in the biting cold, the horrifying truth hit me. Crow wasn't just protecting his lie. He was erasing it, one person at a time, and Elias was next. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to see what happens next in this fight for the truth, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of the story. The sharp crack of the rifle shot echoed in Clara's ears, a sound that lingered long after the quarry fell silent and the world went still. She stood frozen at the edge of the ravine, her gaze fixed on the gray, misty depths where Thomas had vanished. The frost beneath her boots felt dangerously thin, like the last fragile barrier between the truth she knew and the oblivion that had just swallowed a man whole. Silas Crow had been thorough. He always was. His precision was a chilling thing, a cold, calculated force that left no room for error or witnesses. By the time Clara spurred her horse back towards Stonebridge, the town was already stirring with a grim, unsettling purpose. News traveled fast in these parts, especially when it was carried on the wind of a looming execution. Shops that normally opened at dawn were already unbolting their doors. Men gathered in small, tight clusters, their voices low and hushed, their conversations punctuated by grave looks. The women, however, were different. They hurried along the boardwalks, their eyes deliberately avoiding the gallows that rose in the center of the square. A stark, skeletal frame against the pale morning sky. It looked like a monstrous wooden cross, a monument to a justice that felt anything but just. Elias saw it all in her eyes the moment she reached his cell. The hope she'd carried, now extinguished. He didn't need her to say the words. They killed him, he stated, his voice flat, devoid of surprise. It wasn't a question. Clara could only nod, the tears she refused to shed burning hot behind her eyes. He tried to help, she whispered, her voice cracking. Elias closed his eyes, his face a mask of weary resignation. For a fleeting moment, Clara thought he might finally break, that the crushing weight of his fate would shatter him. But he didn't. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, pulling himself up as if the full burden of destiny had finally settled where it belonged. He met her gaze, his own eyes clear and dangerously calm. "Then listen to me," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "When this is over, there is no over without you," she cut in, her voice fierce. She wouldn't let him speak of a future she couldn't imagine. Heavy footsteps echoed down the stone corridor, stopping just outside the bars. The warden stood there, his face impassive, a ring of keys jangling at his hip. "It's time," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. By noon, the crowd in the square had doubled, a sea of somber faces turned towards the gallows. Clara saw Silas Crow standing near the front, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, his hands clasped before him. He was the very picture of solemn, righteous justice, a pillar of the community overseeing a grim but necessary duty. A murmur rippled through the onlookers as Elias was led out, the heavy clink and drag of his chains the only sound that broke the tense silence. Clara pushed her way forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, like a wild horse trapped in a pen. The judge, a man with a perpetually worried face, climbed the steps of the platform. He looked pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held up a piece of paper. He cleared his throat, opened his mouth to speak, but then stopped. A strange look crossed his face. He looked out over the crowd, then down at Elias, and finally, his gaze landed on Crow. "I cannot proceed," he announced, his voice thin but carrying across the suddenly silent square. A confused stir went through the crowd. Crow's head snapped up, his placid demeanor instantly gone. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "New evidence has come to light," the judge continued, his voice gaining strength, trembling but firm. "Evidence that casts serious doubt on this conviction." Crow took a step toward the platform. "This is madness. The man is a convicted killer." From the edge of the crowd, another voice rang out, clear and strong. "No, this is truth." All heads turned. An old man emerged from the throng, his body bent and weathered by time, but his eyes sharp and clear. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait, carrying the weight of years and secrets. Clara recognized him instantly from the stories Elias had told her. Jonah Red, a former ranch hand of Crow's, a man who had vanished without a trace the very night of the murder. "I saw it," Jonah said, his voice raspy but unwavering as he pointed a gnarled finger at Crow. "I saw Silas Crow shoot his own man in the back. Then I watched him plant the evidence to blame Elias Hale." Gasps tore through the square. Crow let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "A ghost. You expect anyone to believe a ghost who crawls out of the woodwork at the last second?" Jonah didn't flinch. He slowly lifted his hand. In his palm lay a rusted deputy's badge, the same one Thomas had worn. He died trying to tell the truth, Jonah said, his voice thick with an ancient grief. I won't let his death be for nothing. Crow's smug smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure fury. His hand flew to the gun at his hip. But Elias moved first. Even in chains, he was faster. He lunged a blur of motion, slamming his shoulder into Crow's arm just as the gun fired. The shot went wide, cracking harmlessly into the air. Chaos erupted. Deputies swarmed forward, tackling Crow to the ground. His hat flew off, landing in the dust. The symbol of his authority, now just a piece of felt trampled underfoot. For a long moment, the entire square held its breath, suspended in disbelief. Then the judge's voice, now booming with renewed authority, cut through the silence. Silas Crow, you are under arrest for the murders of William Packer and Deputy Thomas Finch, and for conspiracy to frame an innocent man. Crow was dragged away, shouting, cursing his empire of lies and fear, bleeding out into the dirt where it belonged. Elias, the strength finally leaving him, dropped to his knees. Clara ran to him, reaching him just as a deputy struck the chains from his wrists. She fell to her knees in front of him, her hands coming up to cup his face. The tears she'd held back for so long finally fell, hot and fast, mixing with the dust on his skin and the bright, hopeful sunlight. It's over, she whispered, the words a prayer. He looked down at her bare hand, then back up at her face, his own eyes full of a complex emotion. You gave up everything, he said softly, his voice full of awe and regret. She managed a smile through her tears, a genuine, radiant smile. No, she corrected him. I bought you back. Weeks later, the town of Stonebridge, now being called Red Willow again by its oldest residents, felt different. It felt lighter. The gallows were torn down, board by board. Crow's sprawling ranch was seized by the territory. Jonah Reed gave his testimony, a simple, irrefutable account of the truth, and then, just as quietly as he'd appeared, he vanished again, this time by his own choice, to a life of peace he had long been denied. On a quiet evening, with the day's work done, Clara and Elias stood outside their small cabin. The setting sun painted the vast plains in shades of gold and rose. Elias took her hand, his touch gentle. He pressed something cool and familiar into her palm. She looked down. It was the ring. Her ring. The one she'd sold. I tracked it down, he said, a sheepish grin on his face. Cost me a lot more pride than it did money to get it back. She slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had never left. They stood together in the fading light, the prairie wind brushing past them, to lives stitched back together from the very edge of destruction. Sometimes, they were learning, love isn't just a promise whispered in the good times. Sometimes it's a sacrifice. Sometimes it's sold, broken, and thought to be lost forever, only to be reborn from the ashes, just in time to save a life. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the Old West. We'll see you next time.